Okay, sorry about that. Well, I had 3 introductory remarks to make, and now there's 4, actually. The first one is, the router went down earlier this week. We did get it replaced, but in the process of replacing it, I didn't think about, I have to reprogram this wireless rerouter. And that's why we suddenly had a conflict there. So, anyways, the router got replaced and we're back up online, but now I gotta get that. So, apologies to those of you watching online, we're a little bit late, and I don't have the Duo going, because I need the wireless in here to make that work. That's the first thing. Second thing is, we almost got dropped again on our property insurance this week. It was very close, because our underwriter was, for whatever reason, it had to come through our agent, was under the impression we were meeting in the house for services, and they didn't have record of this building. So we were within a day and a half of the underwriter dropping coverage, which, again, I don't know why they wait till such short notice to tell us. But after I took pictures and everything, the underwriter was happy with what we're doing, and so it got reapproved for the next year. That's number 2. Number 3, if you've already read the announcements in the bulletin, you see that we have someone interested with a definite interest in the property. This young lady, she lives closer into Atlanta. She has 3 kids. They were looking to buy something out of the city a ways, and she found our property shortly before Jewel took it off of the market. But then when she went back to look at it again, she saw it was off the market, but there were little remnants of it, and so she got in touch with me through our webpage, and she asked if she could come look at the property. And I said, well, I suppose that doesn't hurt, so sure, come and look at it. And I explained to her, I said, just understand that our church's intentions is to stay here and to build our church here. And she says, I understand. So she looked at it yesterday, and when she got done looking at it, she told me, she says, I'm definitely interested in purchasing it, if you guys are at all interested in selling it. And I told her that, okay, understand that, you know, we had a buyer at $600,000, and the market hasn't dropped, so we're not gonna drop from that number, I don't think. I said, in fact, everything's gone up a little bit since then, so the price might go up, but that's up to the congregation. I said, but also whether or not we sell is up to the congregation. I don't make that decision. And she says, okay, could you let them know that I'm definitely interested in buying the property? So, now we have a new little wrinkle to consider. So I wanted you guys to know that. And she wanted you to know that, and I told her I would get back to her your reactions. So if you have a thought, you can express it as soon as you can, so that I can let her know. Otherwise she'll have to, and she'll want to move on to looking for something else. Now, the 4th thing, and this gets us into our Bible study. Last week, Bill raised a question concerning, everybody have a copy?
Thank you.
You have a copy, Joe? You guys? You need a copy? I'm just going to hand you a stack. Pass them on down. Last week, Bill raised a point with concerning something I said about the gospel going out into all the world and even making it over here to the Western Hemisphere. And I got to thinking about, okay, what did I actually say? So I went back and watched the video of Bible class, and I think he's right. I think I way overstated the point, because I stated it in such a positive way that made it sound like, yes, within the 1st century AD, Christian missionaries already made it over to the Western Hemisphere. And I was drawing on something that I had read, but I did some more study on it, more research on it, and that idea, unfortunately, actually comes from the Mormon Church, not from any Christian sources. And the problem is if you are used to reading a bunch of books, sometimes people will latch on to information that is incorrect. I'm guilty of that in the way I presented it last week. I didn't read it from a Mormon source. I read it from another source who latched on to something. There's not good evidence that the gospel made it to the Western Hemisphere prior to the 1500s, a little bit more. Now, there are some who still say there are little pockets of evidence that perhaps there is a considerably earlier date, but I think Bill is correct that bit of information is fishy at best.
He's saying just the gospel?
The gospel message, yes.
It doesn't say God's word's been all around the planet already.
Well, there is the psalm that says, their word has gone out into all the world. And then in the New Testament, that verse from the psalm is quoted. In the psalm, it's in reference to creation. But in the New Testament, the reference is, no, the gospel message is being proclaimed in all the world. But
if you go Adam and Eve, Noah, Babylon, it's already been.
So that might explain the little pockets of information, the little pockets of data that, like all societies have a record of a flood, right? Now, some people say, well, that's where Christianity got it from. They got it from this ancient fable that originated in Mesopotamia, they say. But I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but so there's all kinds of little pockets that all societies have that are evidence of God's word having been told to at least their ancestors, so they carried it over, and you can even see it in some of the religious traditions of paganism. But the gospel message, the very specific message that the Son of God came into the world to take on our sin and to die to take them all away, is not something that we can say definitively, or even with any slight degree of certainty, did make it over into the Western Hemisphere prior to around 1500. So Bill was right to call me out on that one, and I did overstate it last week. That doesn't undermine the point I'm getting to with this discussion of the Olivet Discourse. The point is, first of all, even if verses 4 through 14 are a description of how things will be in the world right before Judgment Day, which it's not, that's not what these verses are talking about, but even if it was, the point is our attention as believers is not to be focused on all the consequences of sin in the world. Our attention is to be focused on the remedy for sin, which is the preaching of the gospel. Excuse me. And so Jesus says, don't be alarmed. The end is not yet. These are but the beginning of birth pains. But notice the things that he mentions are things that have been going on in the world ever since sin. So, first of all, in that sense, they're not a description of Judgment Day, but the other main reason these aren't a description of Judgment Day is because that's not what Jesus is talking about in these verses, even though it's constantly being presented as the sign of the end of the times. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. So with that, we finished up through verse 14 last week. I want to go into verses 15 through, well, hopefully we'll get most of the way done here today, but I consumed quite a bit of time doing technical work. Let me read verses 15 and forward here. So when you see the abomination of, notice that word so, it's important there, right? So, when you see the abomination of desolation, and we're going to talk about that because that's an important phrase, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So, question is, what is the abomination of desolation? If you go back to Daniel 11, verse 31, you will find what that abomination of desolation is. Let me read that verse to you. Daniel 11. Verse 31. Okay. An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolation. Okay, first of all, he talks about arm shall stand on his part. He's talking about, he's in the midst of a prophecy about the kingdoms that are going to arise in the world, culminating in the rising of the kingdom of God, which, by the way, is not heaven specifically. The kingdom of God is Christ's rule in our hearts by faith. Right? He's not a king one day in the future. He's a king right now. And what's he king of? Well, he's king of his kingdom. What's his kingdom? His kingdom is his believers. So, now I got myself distracted. This is a prophecy concerning kingdoms that will arise, ultimately leading to that kingdom. But this is before he gets to that kingdom. And he's talking about the kingdom that will arise, and an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. That's another way of saying the holy place of the temple. Okay? They're going to pollute the holy place. And shall take away the daily sacrifice. Right? Okay, the daily sacrifice is what the priest had to do day by day in the temple. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So he's talking about here in the temples, an abomination that makes desolate. Now we're going to come back to that in a moment, but ultimately what we're talking about is the desecration of the temple. And that was carried out by Titus who at the time, well, I think he was emperor, but maybe he was yet just general. I can't remember. But this took place in 69 AD, I believe, when Titus, his legion surrounded Jerusalem, and they went in and they did a couple of things. They set up an eagle, the symbol of the Roman Empire, in the Holy of Holies of the temple. The other thing they did was they slaughtered a pig on the altar of the Holy of Holies, which was, from the Mosaic law, a pig is an unclean animal. That's why they chose a pig, to desecrate the temple. But the abomination that makes the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, standing in the holy place, was the emblem of Caesar being God, essentially. That's what the eagle was all about. Next, according to verses 16 and 20, to what event must Jesus be referring and why? Notice what he says in verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. If this is in reference to Judgment Day, how does that make any sense? It doesn't, does it? Is there any place anybody can go to flee Judgment Day? No. And who's he telling to flee? Is he telling the unbelievers to flee? That's the only people who have a reason to flee on Judgment Day, but that's not who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to his disciples, believers. They are supposed to flee when they see the abomination that makes desolation show up in the temple. He's giving them a signal to say, look, this is when what's going to happen? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So he's saying, that's when you're supposed to flee, before that happens. Okay? And then verse 20 also says, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Does that make sense when you're thinking about Judgment Day? No. Now, I don't know what season the earth is going to be on Judgment Day. It doesn't matter. Because in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, we're going to be back in a state of perfection. So that we won't experience any pain or sorrow or discomfort. So again, it just doesn't even make sense to apply this to Judgment Day. What does the word tribulation mean?
The cause of pain and suffering.
The cause of pain and suffering, or the actual pain and suffering that we endure from various circumstances. In this context, it's the circumstances of the city being laid siege, first of all, for almost a year. And all the deprivation that went along with that inside the city. You can read the historical account written by Josephus. That's extra biblical, of course. And Josephus was not a Christian, but he gave an accurate description of the things that took place inside the city of Jerusalem while the Roman soldiers had Jerusalem surrounded. And it was quite brutal, quite sickening if you read it. And I'm not going to go into all the detail, but most of the devastation wasn't even caused by Rome. It was caused by the Jews afflicting one another. But the point here is Judgment Day a day of tribulation for us or for Jesus' disciples? No. So again, if we apply this to Judgment Day, this tends to make us more terrified of that day to come, rather than more hopeful like we're supposed to be. For whose sake will those days be shortened? Jesus says, for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. The elect now aren't just a small group of believers, like the disciples or the little church in Jerusalem, but the elect is a reference to all those who will come to faith through the proclamation of the gospel going out. So, to rightly understand this phrase, the days being cut short just means God's going to put a limit on how long this carrying out of this tribulation will be, so that the gospel will continue to be spread. And interestingly, the Roman armies weren't only intent in getting the Jews and destroying Jerusalem, they were looking for all the Christians too. But it's interesting when you read the historical account that suddenly they just gave up, or they just quit rounding up all the Christians. Now, more persecution came later, that's true, but in the area of Jerusalem it was cut short from a human perspective, that they didn't finish the job of rounding up all the Christians. And so, for the sake of the elect, the gospel continued to go out. Let's go on from there. Verse 23 through 28. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Jedi.
If they're the elect and they get led astray, how could they be the elect?
They can't.
So it says,
And that's why it says,
the elect would be.
if it were possible.
Oh,
If possible. And in the Greek here, this is, grammatically, this is so clear that it's not possible.
okay.
There's four ways of presenting what's called a conditional statement in the Greek language. In English, is really just one, and then you have to decide which one it is. In the Greek, there's a grammatical construction for four different kinds of conditional sentences. And this one is the one that says, it's called, there's one that is the condition of fulfillment. There's one that is conditional of possible fulfillment. There's one that is condition of non-fulfillment. And there's one that is a condition of future. I don't remember how it goes. This one is a condition of non-fulfillment. It can't be done. The elect can't be deceived. Okay? And that's what Jesus is saying. He says, but it will seem as though even the elect would be deceived by it. So what further warning did Christ give his believers concerning those days? Well, the next warning is false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. I don't think you can say this is some special event like wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, pestilences, because that's been going on also since sin entered into the picture, since God raised his first promise to send a Savior. There's evidences of that throughout the Old Testament, but also in history that people would write. Even today we have people claiming to be Christ, right? It's just something that happens. The latest one that I was made aware of is a guy, I think he's in Jamaica, and he claims to be Christ returned to the earth. And of course he has like 5 or 6 wives, and he lives in a great mansion, and you know, the things he says are not in agreement with, if he were Christ, what he said in the Gospels. So we know he's a false Christ. But those will constantly be rising. Now, what is the meaning of the picture presented in verse 27? For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, understand, we have the word come there twice in different forms. The first one, where he says, as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, that's this one. Okay? That's a direction. And from our perspective, that's exactly what happens, right? The sun rises in the east, and when it does, it gives light as far as we can see that way. We don't just see light over here, we see it the whole spans. But then the second coming, he says, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Except now it's not the direction thing, it's the presence. I was in a discussion this week with one of my professors from seminary, and the way he likes to translate the Greek word here is the word appearance or showing. I think that's a fine one as long as you don't think of it as having to have this as its precursor. Because, well, we're about to enter into the season of Advent, right? Next Sunday is Advent. What's the word Advent mean? Anybody know? It means he is coming. Okay? And the reason the church picked 3 weeks of Advent is to focus in on 3 different ways that Christ is coming. The first one is he came in the flesh back on a historical date. The last one is what you might expect. He is coming on the last day to judge all the world. But there's a middle one. Well, you got past, you got future. What do you got in the middle? Present. He is always coming, because what was his promise before he ascended? Lo, I am with you always. That is a reference to this. But understand, before he said, lo, I am with you always, and before he gave the Great Commission, right before that statement, so there was one other thing he said. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. When we talk about the coming of Christ, his presence, that's what we're supposed to be thinking about, is his authority over heaven and earth, which means he is ruling everything right now. 1, for the blessing of his church, and 2, to carry out individual temporal judgments, even right now on the earth, for those who oppose his kingdom. And that's how we are to view the things that are going on in the world. There's Christ operating. Now, from our perspective, that's not the way it seems. From our perspective, it seems, woe is us. We're all going to perish together. We're not going to perish. Now, I'm not saying we're not going to die, or we won't have some hard circumstances, but we're not going to perish as Christ exercises his authority. And so he uses one picture, the picture of the sun rising and how it gives light from one end of heaven to the other, over the earth. He says, so also will be the presence or the coming of the Son of Man. I don't like even using the word coming here, because it just doesn't allow us to think correctly. So also will be the presence of the Son of Man. And that's the question the disciples were asking about. Their first question was, when will these things happen? Secondly, what will be the sign of your presence? How do we know that you really will be here in the midst of all of this calamity? And Jesus says, Well, it's going to be obvious, just like the sun is obvious, right? My presence will be seen in the way that I bring judgment on my enemies and blessing on my church. And isn't that what we see? Even think back to the persecution of the early Christian church by the Roman Empire. What do we see? Do we see the church shriveling and dying? No. Even in the midst of all of that calamity, we see the church thriving and prospering. Go back to the Reformation, when the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were intent on squelching the gospel that Martin Luther and the others who were with him proclaimed. Do we see the gospel being squelched? No. We see it being proclaimed more broadly. And then judgment came on the Roman Empire and to an extent on the papacy in the Church of Rome, but not in the way that we may want to think of it. But so you have a judgment, but you have the blessing. The gospel continues to be proclaimed, and it even thrives in the midst of persecution and hostility. So that's the picture here. We know Christ is present because we see the gospel still being proclaimed. Think about how much effort has been exerted to extinguish the message of the gospel. For 2,000 years now. I mean, we could really say there has been no greater focus of the world than that focus. Stop the preaching of the gospel. Stop these Christians. And what happens? The gospel spreads. And the elect are gathered. And then he, well, what is the coming of the Son of Man? There I have the word erchomai. That's the Greek word. You have it here. And then you have the word parousia, and that's this one. Let me give you another demonstration of those words used in their context in other places, so you can see exactly what's being said. So I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 4, verse 17. These are in different contexts, but you will get the sense of the words. 1 Corinthians 4. Verse 17. First Corinthians, oh, I was looking at the wrong chapter. Good, now I don't know why I chose that verse. That one doesn't make sense. I'm going to have to figure out what I did there. Let me go to 2 Corinthians 7, verse 6. That one makes more sense. That's the one that's parousia, and you can get a definite sense here. Okay, here's what Paul says. Nevertheless, God, that comforts those that are cast down, comforted us by the coming of Titus. He says, so we were comforted by the coming of Titus. The word used there in the Greek is the second. Have you ever been comforted by someone who was traveling toward you in a direction? No, you're comforted when they're there with you, right? There's no comfort to be had in someone driving down the street. I mean, you may look forward to it, but what are you looking forward to? You're actually looking forward to their arrival, their presence. And that's the word here. Now, they're consistent in translating this word coming, but that's not what the word is. It's not that directional travel. It is the fact that they're there. So Paul and his companions were comforted when Titus showed up, and he tended to them in their afflictions. I'll have to look up what verse I intended to have on the Erechomai. But again, just understand, the first word is this traveling in a direction toward. The other one is, if you want to say what happens after this, that's fine. Just understand with Jesus, he's always present. Let's see. I think verse 15 gets me into the next section. I don't have time for that right now. Well, no, I think I can finish this up through this section. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, pay attention to this, because what does your mind tell you as I read those verses? That sounds a lot like Judgment Day, doesn't it? Sounds like. Be careful of that. That is as deceiving as I just feel. We don't do theology by what it sounds like, just like we don't do theology by what I feel. We do theology by getting into Scripture and saying, okay, what is this actually saying? So, how are we to take the words of verse 29? Well, we have some comparisons. Isaiah 13. Verses 9 and 10. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Right? That's very familiar. That sounds very close to this, right? Talking about the sun, moon, and stars. Now, the interesting thing is here in Isaiah 13, he does seem to be talking about the last day. But there are other ones where that is not the case. Ezekiel 32, 7 and 8. And when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord God. That sounds very similar, doesn't it? I'm going to cover the sun with a cloud. The moon will not give light. The bright lights of heaven will be dark. So he's using that description. If you go back up to verse 2 of Ezekiel 32, you will see that this is a specific judgment of God on an individual nation that we know as Egypt. So that language does not specifically or always refer to Judgment Day. Daniel 8:10.
say it doesn't sound as much like Judgment Day.
Doesn't sound as much like judgment. Okay, you're on the right track. Keep that thought in mind. Daniel 8, verse 10. Okay. And it waxed great. Okay, verse 9 says, and out of one of them came a fourth little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heavens, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Now, I don't have time to go in through the whole chapter here, but this particular prophecy is in regards to the rise of the papacy. And notice what the papacy, remember the papacy, the Pope, sets himself up in the temple of God and proclaims himself to be God, and he's kind of mirroring God here. He's throwing down the stars. He's casting down the lights. Are you getting an idea of what the lights might be? What does the Pope claim to have authority over? He claims to bear two swords. One is authority over the church. The second is authority over the nations, kingdoms. Look into history and you'll see how the Pope, he's always inserting himself into political issues, isn't he? And it doesn't matter which Pope it is, they all come with the thought that we have the power over the kingdoms of the world. They pretend to be Christ, even to the point of proclaiming themselves to be God. Joel 2, 30 through 31. This is the last one I can take. Joel 2, 30 and 31. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. What does that sound like? Sounds pretty much the same, doesn't it? Well, this is actually in reference to how the Lord overthrows the kingdom of Judah. Okay, this is not about Judgment Day. All of this happens as the Lord is establishing his church. And that's what happened, from Pentecost onward. God is setting up his kingdom, though it was always set up. Don't take that too far. His kingdom has always been a spiritual kingdom. It's never been an earthly kingdom. Baptist dispensational theology, nonetheless. But the point here is that the same language is being used here in reference to a temporal earthly kingdom. And I think if you were to examine the scriptures, you're going to find, no, I shouldn't say I think. When you examine the scriptures, you're going to find when this kind of language is used, reference to the sun, moon, and stars being darkened, it's very similar to that dream that Joseph had about the sun bowing down to him, a little star, and the moon bowing down to him, a little star, and 11 other stars bowing down to him, a little star. And his mother and his dad and his brothers understood exactly what that dream meant. It meant that not only were all of them who were, most of them, the only one not, Benjamin, all of them were older than him, except for Benjamin, which means they had more authority than he did. But even his mom and dad, the sun and the moon, the greater lights, they were the higher authority in that family structure. That's how we are to understand the lights, the sun and the moon and the stars. They are the authorities that God has given on the earth, but guess who has the power to remove that authority? God And to whom has he given all authority in heaven and on earth? To Christ. So when Jesus talks about that here in the Olivet Discourse, we are not supposed to think that Judgment Day is, especially for us as his believers, as a day of doom and gloom and, oh, it's so calamitous. No, we are to understand that Christ is using these words to explain what he's going to do in regards to the nation of Judah. He is going to remove the authority that he himself has granted, and he's going to overthrow it. And that's exactly what 70 AD was all about. Christ removing those earthly authorities. And there are all kinds of references in the Old Testament to authorities being pictured as lights. And so when he uses this picture, that's what he's talking about. Now, will on Judgment Day authorities be removed from all the kingdoms of the earth? Yes. So there is some similarity between the individual judgments that he brings upon nations and that great judgment that happens on the last day. But read them in their context and keep them in their context. And the context here is, when will these things happen? When will these stones not be left one upon another? And the answer to that question is 70 AD. From our perspective, from their perspective, is when you see the abomination that makes desolation standing in the holy place. Questions or comments? Now I went too far. I got to set up Holy Communion, so we'll stop there and finish it up next week.